All right, so let's begin our talk looking at the epidermis. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention how if we were to measure the mass of just our skin all by itself, it is approximately 20 pounds in an adult. Okay, so that's a pretty significant amount of your total body mass. And because it is made up of two or more tissue types, right? We just talked about how it's made up of all four of the different major tissues of the body. It is considered an organ. So our skin is considered an organ, even though we really kind of don't think of it that way. Okay, so we're going to start with the epidermis. And so as we've seen, this prefix before epi means on top, right? And so the epidermis lives on top of the dermis, and it has four main cell types that we need to talk about. There are the keratinocytes, which are the epithelial cells of the skin of the epidermis. We're going to see that they contain this protein keratin. We've seen this before. Hopefully you recall that keratin can be the protein type that makes up intermediate filaments. So we're going to be seeing intermediate filaments, and we're going to be seeing desmosomes coming back into our radar when we're talking about the structure of the epidermis. Okay. We're also going to see that there are these pigment producing cells called melanocytes. Whoops. Melanocytes that produce this pigment that can be a reddish color, brownish, yellow. Okay, so it has a few different colorations to it. And so we'll talk about how this pigment melanin contributes to our skin coloration. And this is the major pigment molecule that's produced to create darker skin tones and to also create a tanning effect in our skin. And then there are these Merkel cells. Okay, oh, actually I wanted to add a little bit more about melanocytes. So a freckle, this is just kind of fun. A freckle is a concentrated little spot of melanin. Okay, whereas a mole is a concentration of melanocytes, the actual cells that produce the melanin. Okay, and we're going to see that melanin specifically is important for protecting our cells from UV damage, from mutation that can happen from ultraviolet light. So we'll talk a little bit about that and talk about skin cancer as a consequence of UV-induced DNA mutation that happens and can cause different types of skin cancer, unfortunately. Okay, Merkel cells, Merkel, cute, kind of funny, weird. Merkel cells are sensory cells that they convey. Why is that so thick? Sorry, let me fix this. That they convey sensation, the touch sensation. Okay, basically when they're compressed, when there's pressure placed on them, they'll secrete chemicals that communicate to sensory neuron fibers. Okay. And then lastly, we have the Langerhans cells, also known as dendritic cells. And these are our immune cells. So these are the white blood cells that live within our skin. And they are these phagocytic cells that can phagocytose microbes, chemicals, and debris. Okay, and they are involved in turning on an immune response, okay? Kind of turning on, getting more troops, getting more immune cells involved with a coordinated immune response if need be. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to flesh out a little bit more about keratinocytes, and then we're going to talk about how the epidermis is actually composed into these defined layers, and that there are certain cells and certain characteristics for each of these layers that we're going to learn. So first of all, let me just add a little bit more about keratinocytes. These are the most abundant cell type in the skin because the keratinocytes, again, are the epithelial cells, right, of the skin. Okay, and that they contain this protein keratin and another version of it, keratohyalin, that together form intermediate fibers, okay? These rope-like filaments that we've already studied. Hopefully you can remember some of that, right? Here we go, we're bringing it up again. Okay, so a special type of intermediate fibers, and the functions of this, as we know, to provide strength, to resist tension, right? So that they don't break whenever we stretch our skin out. We're going to see that there is a waterproofing effect that happens as a result of some of the activities of the keratinocytes. We'll talk about that a little bit. There's some other stuff going on. And then I want to point out that as you move from the bottommost layer of the epidermis up to the topmost layer, that as you move up, the keratinocytes contain more and more keratin, and then at some point they start to die off, and then all the layers above that point where they die off, all the cells are just these dead bags of keratin, okay? And so hopefully you know that, right? That the topmost layers of your skin are actually these dead skin cells, these dead epithelial cells that can slough off and readily slough off really easily, okay? So let's write this down. More keratin as you go. Toward topmost layer of the epidermis, and that cells at top layers are actually dead. So we're going to talk about that process and where exactly they're dying off and why and how and all that stuff. Okay. And so very, very critical that keratinocytes are going to be found in every single layer that we are going to learn about for the epidermis. Okay, so that's where we're going next. We're going to talk about the epidermis. Okay. All right, and by the way, keros, where this comes from, keros means horn. Kind of weird, right? Keros means horn. And so I think that's, you know, really referring to the toughened, thickened, protective quality that skin provides for our body, that it's this kind of thick, and that horn tissue and nails are just super, super specialized forms of epidermis that have even more and thicker, a little bit molecularly different type of keratin in it. So yeah, your nails and other mammals, hooves and stuff are made up of keratin, okay? All right, so layers of the epidermis. All right, so what we're gonna see is that, first of all, they've got weird names to them, okay? Because here we are, we're using Latin terminology, and that every single layer contains the first word stratum, okay? Stratum, right? And stratum means horizontal layer. That is what it means in Latin. And so this means, right, remember when we're picturing epithelial cells, right, that there are these cells that are stacked end to end to end next door to each other with all these intercellular connections going on between them. And so we're going to see these layers and sheets, right, that make up the epidermis. Now, going from bottom to the top, I have, I think, a kind of cute, silly, kind of dumb little mnemonic to help you remember this, okay? And so it's starting at the bottom and going to the topmost layer, okay? It's you can laugh, I don't care, but I think it might actually help you, so whatever. So it's best skin gets lots of, I know it's not a real word, but we're just gonna go with it, care. Okay, best skin gets lots of care. Okay, so in a mnemonic, the first letter of each word corresponds to the first letter of the actual words that I want you to remember. So remember, stratum is the first word of each layer. So we have the stratum basalis, and basal means bottom, or you could call it the stratum germinativum. My mnemonic doesn't work for that, but oh well. Stratum basalis, then the next most layer is the stratum spinosum, which means spiny. We're gonna see how the cells kind of have a spindly, spiny, spiky nature to them. Okay, then the next one is stratum granulosum. We're gonna see that there's all these granules found within this layer, and we'll talk about what the heck those granules are and what they do. Then, oops, shoot. And then we have stratum lucidum. Lucidum means clear, okay? And that's only found, this is kind of a special one. It's in thick skin only. Thick skin only, guys. So palms of the hands and soles of the feet. Okay. And then at the very top, we have the stratum corneum. And corneum means horn, okay? All right, so let's look at this. This is a nice side-by-side picture of the real deal. So here's actually what it would look like under the microscope. And then this is the artist's interpretation of all these different layers that you see. Okay, so let's go from bottom to the top, shall we? All right, so at the bottom, we see the dermis that lives underneath. Okay, we see this is all dermis. Okay, and that corresponds to this. Okay, and then look at that. Okay, the very first layer here is the stratum basalis. Okay, is the stratum basalis, and that contains one layer of cells, and it contains these various cell types. We'll write it down in a minute or so, but we see, ooh, there's the melanocytes that produce melanin. Ooh, there's a Merkel cell, right? That was our sensory touch receptor cell that when it gets squished, it secretes chemicals that get received by these sensory nerve endings here, the sensory motor neuron endings. Okay, and then of course we see these goldish colored cells are the keratinocytes, okay? And we're gonna learn that there are stem cells located in this stratum bacilli layer that will divide to continually create fresh new keratinocytes, okay? All right, so then above we see multiple layers that make up the next. And remember, it's best skin gets lots of care, right? So the next layer, stratum spinosum, and we see that the cells kind of have a bit of a point to them, okay? So that's from thick filaments bundling across and strapping them together, and we'll write about this. We also see the immune cell, the Langerhans or DC, that can be found cruising within the stratum spinosum, as well as cruising in the nextmost layer, which is the stratum granulosum. And as you see, this layer, there's just a ton of granules that have been released by the cells. This is when the cells are starting to die and they're flattening as well. See how they kind of start as a cube shape, and as we go up in the layers, they're flattening out, and then man, are they super flattened into that squamous shape by the time they're in the stratum granulosum layer, and the cells are starting to die, okay, because of the granules going on there. We'll write about this. And then that leads us to the topmost layer, the stratum corneum, which also is a truck ton of layers. Look at that. And all throughout the stratum corneum, the cells are completely dead. They're completely flat, just little flat sacks of keratin, and that's all they've got. They're just these dead carcasses that don't even have organelles anymore. They're just chock full of keratin, okay? All right, so let's write some notes. So the first layer, stratum bacilli, right, which is the bottommost layer. Okay, and this is really important that it is the site of cell division. This is where keratinocytes are continually born, right? We talked about one of the unique characteristics of epithelial tissue being that it's regenerative, right? That there's constantly new layers being generated, and that's from stem cells that live within the stratum bacilli, and they divide to create more keratinocytes. So the stem cells are called basal cells, okay? So that's kind of hopefully easy to remember, because basal, it's within the bacilli or basal layer of the epidermis. Okay, so I want you to know this. This is very important. So they divide to produce the keratinocytes. We also saw that there are melanocytes present, remember, and they produce melanin. There are Merkel cells, and typically it's at hairless places that Merkel cells are found. And those are our touch sensation cells that live right next to nerve endings of sensory motor neurons. And then finally, just to reiterate, there are keratinocytes, the newly born keratinocytes that are formed from the basal cells. Okay, next going up, best skin, stratum spinosum, the spiny layer. This is because the cells are connected to one another with keratin intermediate filaments. Some textbooks call these tonofibrils. That's fine. I'm just going to call them keratin intermediate filaments. And that we've seen these pictures before, right? Where the cells live next to each other, right? And then there are the desmosomes, right? The little complexes on the lateral sides of the cells. And then those intermediate filaments run from one end to the other, right? And those thick rope-like structures. And so they're really connecting them together. And so because of this, this sort of changes the shape a little bit of the cell to give it more of a spiky appearance, okay? And so we know the whole point of that is to provide that strength to endure the mechanical stress, to prevent the cells from rupturing, right? To maintain that physical wall that we need. We don't want anything to get down in between the cells. Okay, and specifically I'm talking about keratinocytes, right? Okay, and then we saw in the spinosum layer, we have the dendritic cells, which are the immune cells, that they have two functions. They will turn on an immune response in the body. Okay, so we have inflammation and we have other immune cells coming to this infection site and helping to take care of the problem. And then they also phagocytose pathogens, debris, cancer cells, other clumps of weird chemicals and stuff. All right, best skin gets lots of care. Best skin gets, that leads us to the granular layer or the stratum granulosum, okay, which is called that because it contains cells that are secreting, okay, granules that contain keratohyalin and lipid granules, okay? And so what these do, okay, so the lipids are the lamellated granules. What these do is they basically are like a waxy coating on the outside of the cells, okay? Just like how people go, I don't know who these people are, but you people that are really good about taking care of your cars, I'm not as good as that. But people will get their cars waxed or will wax their cars themselves or whatever, right? And that is there as a protective coating to prevent things like dirty water and water carrying molecules that are like water, because water dissolves all kinds of things that are like itself, right? So it protects the paint of your car, right? So same kind of thing here is that these lipids are not like water. They are chemically different than water. And so, right, lipids don't mix. We learned about this with the phospholipid bilayer. Lipids don't mix with water. And so this lipid serves like a coat to prevent water from being transported. So it helps to waterproof the outside surface of your body, okay? And I encourage you, have you ever looked at how water beads on the surface of your skin when you get it wet with just like a little bit of water? Take note of that. That water doesn't mix and dissipate across the surface of your skin with little tiny drops. It actually forms little beads, and that's from the lamellated granules that have the glycolipids, has the lipids. So this waxy coat is great for waterproofing, but because of that, it also prevents the diffusion of nutrients and wastes in and out of the keratinocytes. And that's a big problem for any cell that wants to continue to live. A cell's got to eat and it's got to poop. So it's got to be able to take in nutrients and things, right? Eating in a way, right? And it has to breathe. It has to be able to transport gases in and stuff, right? And so if it can't eat, it can't breathe, and it can't poop out its waste, well, then guess what happens? the cells start to die, okay? Causes these cells to begin to die. Okay. Okay. And just so you know what cell types are present within the stratum granulosum, we see keratinocytes are the major players, but we also see those dendritic cells. So the dendritic cells are roaming around in two different layers of your epidermis, right? So best skin gets, so stratum spinosum and the stratum granulosum. Those are the two places where DCs are living. Okay, so best skin gets lots of. So only on the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet do we have this extra layer of epidermal tissue. We've got the stratum lucidum, which means thin layer, okay, or clear layer, excuse me. And it's about 3 to 5 layers of dead, flattened keratinocytes. And at this point, they're not dead yet, but they lack organelles. Oh, sorry, they are dead. Excuse me, what am I saying? They're dead, flattened because they have lost all of their organelles. They've lost all their organs from the coating of the granules on the outside surface of the cells that had prevented the diffusion of all of their important materials. Okay. And so again, that's only found in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And then the very last layer of skin, best skin gets lots of care. Topmost layer is the stratum corneum, which is the horn layer. And that is a very thick layer, can be anywhere from 15 to 30 individual sheets or layers of flattened cells. These are the squamous shape, okay? They're completely dead carcasses of cells containing a ton of keratin. And of course, the intermediate fibers. Okay. And I want to also stress that, remember, there are these tight junctions and desmosomes between the keratinocytes to maintain that very important physical barrier. All right, this is where I'm going to stop, guys. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.